Welcome to Course 1, Topic 6, Pretrial Risk Assessment. This course will go over the Public Safety Assessment, which is the tool that is utilized in New Mexico. The learning objectives for this course are to 1. Understand what a pretrial risk assessment is, 2. Learn the history of the Public Safety Assessment, and 3. Gain an overview of how the PSA is scored. What is a pretrial risk assessment tool? Pretrial risk assessment tools are utilized in pretrial services agencies throughout the country. These tools are based on data and evidence that measure an individual's likelihood to appear in court and remain arrest-free during the pretrial stage. The Administrative Office of the Court's Pretrial Justice Division in New Mexico utilizes the Public Safety Assessment, also called the PSA. Let's hear from Mike Jones with the Center for Effective Public Policy, Advancing Pretrial Policy and Research, as he talks about understanding pretrial risk.
A solid understanding of pretrial assessments begins with an awareness about what pretrial assessments measure. Put simply, they measure pretrial risk. But what does that mean? To understand pretrial assessments, we have to examine the type of risk they measure and how they articulate the amount of risk. So we start with two questions: risk of what and how much risk? Let's look at the first question, risk of what? What type of risks do pretrial assessments measure? Most pretrial assessments measure two outcomes: the likelihood that people will fail to appear in court pretrial, and the likelihood that people will be arrested again during the pretrial period. It's also important to recognize what pretrial assessments do not measure. They do not measure the risk of flight. Flight and failure to appear are very different behaviors. We know from research and decades of experience that failure to appear is far more common than is flight from a jurisdiction to avoid prosecution. When people do not show up for court pretrial, it's almost always because they forget about the hearing, had trouble with transportation, were confused about when and where to appear, or they couldn't get off work or find childcare. It's almost never because they fled the jurisdiction. Pretrial assessments also do not measure the likelihood of being arrested for specific crimes. We know from research and experience that people are arrested for a nonviolent or low-level offense far more frequently than they are for a new violent or other serious offense. People are arrested for nonviolent offenses such as property, drug, driving, or public order far more often than they are for a violent offense, such as assault or robbery. Let's move to the second question, how much risk? Again, it's helpful to think about what an assessment tool doesn't tell us. It doesn't tell us who's risky and who is not risky. Risk is not an either-or proposition. Rather, it's more useful to view risk as existing on a continuum or a scale, like the one shown here. People's risk could range from a very small amount, such as 1%, all the way up to a very large amount, such as 99%, with everything in between. Because there are no absolutes, the continuum of risk starts at 1% rather than 0 and ends at 99% rather than 100. There's no such thing as no risk. All people, regardless of their current charges, criminal history, or life circumstances, including you and me, would be at some degree of risk for not appearing in court. Our car could break down, or we could have a serious family emergency. These things would probably cause us to miss court that day. On the opposite side, we've learned there's no guarantee of failure. Even for people with serious charges and long criminal histories, many of them still succeed on pretrial release by appearing in court and remaining arrest-free. Understanding what type of risk that assessments measure and how they articulate that amount of risk is important because assessment results can help you make different pretrial decisions. The three key questions that should guide your examination of your pretrial system are: whom do we release and whom do we detain? How do we release people? And how do we detain people? To answer these questions, we have to know what the risk is for. Is the risk for failure to appear in court or for flight? Is the risk for being arrested for any new offense, even minor ones? Or is the risk for a serious or violent offense? And after we know what the risk is for, we need to know how much risk is present. Is it a little bit or a lot, or somewhere in between? Once you understand what an assessment measures and how it articulates the amount of risk, you're better able to consider the most appropriate and effective role an assessment can play in your pretrial decision-making.
When a pretrial services agency implements a risk assessment, there are certain requirements that must be met in order to do so successfully. First and foremost, the agency must have access to criminal history, not only local criminal history, but history throughout the state as well as the entire country. Secondly, staff need to be educated on risk assessments in general, as well as how to read and interpret that criminal history information. Staff need to be properly trained how to score the tool and what those scores actually mean. Quality assurance protocols are necessary to ensure that the information that goes into the assessment is accurate so that accurate information can be relayed to the court. There also needs to be outcome measures that are based locally as far as failure to appear and rearrest. And lastly, the tool needs to be validated with local data.
We are going to talk about the development of the public safety assessment, the research behind the PSA, and how it was created. The first step was proof of concept. The researchers conducted a thorough review of the existing literature regarding pretrial assessments and factors, which included examining a recent meta-analysis, a comprehensive review of existing pretrial assessment studies. They did this in order to identify what the research already revealed about the strongest predictors of pretrial failure. Remember, in the context of pretrial assessments, pretrial failure means failing to appear in court or being arrested for a new offense while on pretrial release. The next step for the researchers was to conduct a study in Kentucky in order to test what they learned from the meta-analysis. At the time, Kentucky used the Kentucky Pretrial Risk Assessment tool. This tool included both interview-dependent and non-interview-dependent risk factors. The researchers created a revised version of the tool, which excluded the interview-dependent factors. Using 150,000 cases from Kentucky, the researchers compared the results of the original tool with the results of the revised tool. From their review of the existing research and the results of the study, the researchers concluded two things. First, they concluded that criminal history factors are the strongest predictors of pretrial success and failure. So, things like prior convictions, prior failures to appear, and pending charges were the strongest predictors. Second, the researchers also concluded that including interview-dependent factors related to a person's community ties or stability did not improve a tool's predictive power. So things like mental health concerns, substance use, where the person lived, and whether the person was employed, information usually obtained by conducting an interview, did not add to pretrial prediction if criminal history factors are already known. The researchers found that the revised Kentucky tool, without those interview-dependent factors, was equally as predictive as the original tool. This initial research demonstrates that it was possible to create a predictive assessment that does not contain factors that depend on an interview. This is not to say that such factors are not predictive, but the research and studies showed that an assessment tool could be equally as predictive without the interview-dependent information. The next step was to assemble a set of data from a multitude of jurisdictions, so that the researchers could create an assessment that was strongly predictive across a range of diverse jurisdictions. The researchers constructed the largest, most comprehensive multi-jurisdictional pretrial dataset ever. It drew on 1.5 million cases from approximately 300 cities, counties, and federal judicial districts from across the country. Data came from Colorado, Connecticut, Florida, Kentucky, Maine, Ohio, and Virginia. The team received data from the entire federal pretrial system, spanning all 50 states, and they also received data from Washington, D.C. to examine which factors are most predictive of pretrial success or failure. What do you need? You need outcomes. you need to know whether the person succeeded or failed while on pretrial release. So the researchers cleaned the data to include only cases in which the person was released at some point during the pretrial process. If the person was never released, they couldn't test the predictability because there are no outcomes for that person. They stayed in jail. So, after cleaning the data to ensure it included only the people with outcomes and where the factors were known, the researchers had 750,000 cases for their development data set. Next, using this massive data set, the researchers examined relationships in the data. They looked for statistically significant relationships between predictive factors and pretrial outcomes. The researchers tested factors that drew on data from administrative databases, including demographics, current offense, other pending cases, prior convictions, and court appearances. The researchers also tested factors that depended on an interview, such as substance use, mental health, education, employment, and residential stability. They tested for the outcomes that are traditionally used in pretrial risk assessments: failure to appear pretrial and new pretrial criminal arrest. They also tested for a pretrial outcome that was not typically measured: new violent pretrial criminal arrest. This type of pretrial misconduct, a violent crime, not just any crime, is the behavior that decision makers are most concerned about when making pretrial decisions. After all of this analysis, what did the researchers find? The researchers were able to isolate the factors that most effectively predicted the pretrial outcomes. And the results were consistent with prior research. None of the strongest predictors came from interview-dependent factors. The factors they isolated as being most predictive are related to a person's age, current charge, and all the criminal history, including failures to appear. All the data for these factors are drawn from administrative data sources. No interview is needed. The final step was to validate these results. Simply put, they tested if these results held true in other jurisdictions using a different set of data. So they tested this new tool, the PSA, on 500,000 new cases. The results showed that the 9 factors and the weighting of the factors were predictive for these new cases. I'm going to end with the factors themselves. These are the factors that the researchers identified as being the most predictive of the pretrial outcomes: age at current arrest, current violent offense, pending charge at the time of arrest, prior misdemeanor conviction, prior felony conviction, prior violent convictions, prior failure to appear pretrial in the past 2 years, prior failure to appear pretrial older than 2 years, and prior sentence to incarceration. In the next video, you can learn about how the assessment weighs each factor to predict the 3 outcomes and how we arrive at a scaled score of 1 to 6.
Now that we have learned how the PSA was developed, let's dig a little bit deeper. We know that the PSA measures 3 things: the risk of failure to appear, the risk of new criminal arrest while a case is pending, and the risk of new violent arrest while a case is pending. We also know that the PSA consists of 9 factors and it does not require an interview. Let's hear from Mike Jones on how the PSA is scored.
Let's talk about the PSA's 9 factors, how the assessment weighs each factor to predict the 3 outcomes, and how we arrive at a scale from 1 to 6. Here are the 9 PSA factors that the research showed, when used together, are the most predictive of 3 pretrial outcomes: failure to appear, FTA, new criminal activity, NCA, and new violent criminal activity, NVCA. Many other factors about accused people were tested by the researchers, and they either were not predictive of pretrial success and failure, or they were predictive but did not add any predictive strength to the 9 identified factors. That is, once information about these 9 factors is known, knowing additional information about the person did not increase the predictive ability of the assessment. As you can see, Some of the PSA's factors are predictive of some of the PSA outcomes, but not all. For example, 4 of the 9 factors predict likelihood of FTA. Some of those same factors, as well as others, predict NCA or NVCA. Pending charge predicts all 3 outcomes. Here we see for the FTA scale how the relevant factors are weighted and scored. For the FTA outcome, 4 factors are measured: pending charge at the time of arrest, prior conviction, failure to appear in past 2 years, and failure to appear older than 2 years. 3 of these items are scored as 1 point if the answer is yes, and 0 points for no. 1 item is scored as 0, 2, or 4 points, depending on the number of recent prior failures to appear. The weights come directly from the statistical analyses used to develop the PSA. The way to think about points is they are indicators of the likelihood of the outcome occurring. The higher the points, the greater the likelihood. So after these 4 factors are scored, the total points are added together. That raw score, or sum, is converted to a scaled score that goes from 1 to 6. A FTA scaled score of 1 indicates the lowest likelihood of FTA, and a scaled score of 6 indicates the greatest. Now let's look at the NCA scale. 7 factors contribute to the NCA score. Like with FTA, some factors are scored as yes or no, and other factors count the number of instances. You can see that the factors have different weights, depending on the answer. For example, 3 points are scored if the person has a pending charge at the time of the arrest. 1 point is given if the person has a prior felony conviction. Remember that the higher the weight, the greater the likelihood of that outcome occurring. As with FTA, the total points are summed and then converted to a scale score of 1 through 6, with a scaled score of 1 indicating the lowest likelihood of NCA and a score of 6 indicating the greatest. Finally, let's look at the NVCA scale. Getting to the raw score is similar to how FTA and NCA is scored. These 5 factors are scored and the points are added. However, unlike the FTA and NCA scales, the researchers determined that reporting the NVCA score made the most sense as a flag rather than as a score between 1 to 6. So, if a person receives a total number of 0 to 3 points, they do not receive a violence flag. If the points add up to 4 or more, the person receives a flag. The flag indicates an elevated likelihood of being arrested pretrial for a new violent offense. In the next section, we will learn more about what each of these scores tell us about a person's likelihood of pretrial success or failure.
To recap from what Mike Jones has explained in scoring of the PSA, here are the factors: the 4 FTA factors, the 6 NCA factors, and the 5 NVCA factors. Let's look more closely at each factor. 1. Age at current arrest. This information can be obtained from the charging documents and is scored accordingly. Number 2, current violent offense can also be obtained by the charging documents. However, you will need to refer to the New Mexico violent crime list to determine what charges are considered violent in New Mexico. Number 3, pending charge. That is also a yes/no answer. This is obtained through the criminal history or other court databases. Please keep in mind that a pending charge means it is an open pretrial case at the time of arrest. Factor 4, prior misdemeanor conviction. This is a yes/no answer and can be obtained from the criminal history and court databases. There is no time limit on the conviction. A misdemeanor conviction from 10 years ago counts the same as a misdemeanor conviction from last week. Factor 5, prior felony conviction is scored in the same manner. It is a yes/no answer and can be obtained from the criminal history or court database and also has no time limit. Factor 6, number of prior violent crime convictions. This is defined as any crime that is violent in nature or a threat of violence per state statute and local consensus. For New Mexico, you will refer to your New Mexico violent crime list to obtain this information. Factor 7, number of prior FTAs within the past 2 years. This information can be obtained from the criminal history and court databases and is scored accordingly. Factor 8, prior failure to appear older than 2 years. This is a yes/no answer and can be obtained from the criminal history and court databases. The last factor, factor 9, is prior sentence to incarceration. This is a yes/no answer and can also be found in the criminal history or court database. The definition of prior sentence to incarceration is very specific. The sentence must be 14 days or more to serve. Probated time, conditional discharge, or other pretrial detention time is not counted.
Previously, we explained how the PSA weighs each factor to predict the 3 pretrial outcomes. And we discussed how the assessment arrives at a scaled score from 1 to 6. At this point, you might be asking yourself, what do these scores actually mean? What does it tell us when the score is 2 for FTA or 4 for NCA? In this video, we'll look at what those scores tell us about a person's likelihood of succeeding on pretrial release. As we'll see, what the data show us is great news for the community, and it might surprise some of you. The vast majority of people succeed on pretrial release. On average, around 80% of people return for their court appearance and are not arrested for a new offense while on pretrial release. Recall that when the researchers created the PSA, they scored the tool for 750,000 cases in the original development dataset. Then they validated the PSA on 500,000 new cases. What we'll be looking at are the averages of the results from both of those data sets. We'll start by looking at the failure to appear results. The y-axis on the left shows the FTA score, from a low score of 1 at the top to a high score of 6 at the bottom. The x-axis on the bottom shows the possible successful court appearance rates from 0 to 100%. What you can see here, for example, is that the cases that scored a 1 for FTA appeared in court and were not issued a failure to appear warrant or capias at a rate of 89%. The remaining 11% failed to appear for at least one pretrial court hearing. Moving along the FTA score, you can see that among the cases that scored a 3, 81% appeared in court. For the cases that scored a 6, the highest PSA score, 65% still appeared for all of their pretrial court hearings. This tells us that people on pretrial release, even higher scoring people, succeed at relatively high rates. Let's now turn to the results for new criminal arrest. This slide shows the NCA scores and the corresponding arrest-free rates from the development and validation data sets. That is the percentage of cases in which the person was not arrested for any jailable offense while on pretrial release. You can see that in the group with an NCA score of 1, 91% of the people were not arrested. That is, only 9% of the people with an NCA score of 1 were arrested for a new criminal offense during pretrial release. For cases with a score of 3, their arrest-free rate was 78%. And for cases with NCA scores of 6, those assessed as being most likely to be arrested during pretrial release, those whom you may be the most concerned about, they remained arrest-free about half, or 47% of the time. Okay, let's now look at NVCA, New Violent Criminal Arrest. This slide shows the NVCA scores and the corresponding violent arrest-free rates from the development and validation sites. That is the percentage of cases in which the person was not arrested for a new violent offense while on pretrial release. Notably different from the other outcomes, the success rates for NVCA are very high across all scores. You can see that in the group with an NVCA score of 1, 99% of the people were not arrested for a violent offense. At the other end, for cases with NVCA scores of 6, those assessed as being most likely to be arrested for a new violent offense during pretrial release, they were not arrested for a violent offense 90% of the time. Remember that for NVCA, the PSA does not report a 6-point scale like the one shown here. Instead, it creates a flag to indicate a higher likelihood of being arrested for a new violent criminal offense. If a person scores 1 to 3 points on this outcome, there is no flag. A score of 4 or more triggers the flag. Something to consider is that in most jurisdictions, only a small percentage of cases receive the flag. In this group of cases, 94% did not receive the flag. Only 6% of the cases received a score of 4 or more and had the flag. On this slide, we show the outcomes for those without the violence flag and those with the flag. Here you can see that among the cases that did not receive the flag, the bar on the top, 98% were not arrested for a violent offense pretrial. Of the cases that did receive the flag, the bar on the bottom, 92% were not arrested on a violent offense. Thus, people in both groups were very unlikely to be arrested for a new violent offense while on pretrial release. So, big picture, what does the PSA violence flag tell us? It tells us that very few people on pretrial release are arrested for the kinds of offenses that we are the most concerned about. What these data demonstrate is that while the presence of a violence flag means that there is an elevated likelihood of being arrested for a new violent offense, the vast majority of people with the violence flag were not, in fact, arrested. The presence of a flag gives you a reason to look a little closer at the case, to examine the factors to see why the flag is there, to take time to review the case carefully and see if there are other circumstances in the case or the person's history that may justify more restrictive release conditions. You will need to carefully consider how you will use the violence flag, if at all, in your pretrial decision-making. I want to return to what I said at the start of this video. The vast majority of people succeed on pretrial release. Most people attend all of their pretrial court hearings and do not receive warrants for failure to appear. They relatively rarely get arrested for a new offense. And even more rarely do they get arrested for a new violent offense. Data from the PSA research demonstrate very clearly that released people succeed in very high numbers. In both the development and validation data sets, the group with the highest scores on the PSA, scores of 5 or 6, still succeeded about 1/2 to 2/3 of the time. We encourage you to keep these data in mind as you develop and implement your new pretrial policies.